your concerns there?
I think most people are familiar with the trend that we've seen over the last 20 years, and that the Manx towns have declined as offices have moved to the outlying business parks, and people have also moved right across the island to new build housing developments. And what that has created, if you look in Douglas and in the other towns, is there's a multitude of empty plots, and some of those have been vacant for very many years. And what I'm seeking is that we look to prioritise these for development instead of continually concreting over the Manx countryside.
And are you talking specifically about I suppose business developments as opposed to the likes of housing estates or schools, for instance? You may well have a site in the middle of an industrial estate which is perfectly capable to be, it's perfect for development, but you wouldn't build a school there, for instance.
No, I think what I am keen to see is reusing sites in a creative way. So it would be odd to site a school next to a factory, but it might make a lot of sense now for us to look at some of the empty office blocks and look to convert them to residential developments for apartments or key workers' houses. And generally what I'm very keen to see is some vibrancy return to the towns, because what we have created, and I'm sure we didn't set out with a blank sheet of paper to do this, is a situation where many people are now commuting long distances by car, and the centre of our towns are quite empty at times. So I think we can look at this in a more insightful way, and I think it makes a lot of sense to prioritise development on the empty and vacant sites that we have in town ahead of our precious countryside.
Is government to a certain extent beholden to the wants of the developer or the business owner who wants to come and establish here as to where they want their business to be? If you say, well, no, you have to put it in the middle of this area because this is a built-up area and we have an empty plot, they may say, well, I'll take my business to Jersey or Guernsey or further afield.
I don't think government is beholden to any developer in that way. I think government's role is to set the policy, and we should be looking to set the policy which meets the social and economic needs of the island in a kind of more holistic way. So there's a number of different things we could look at. So we can look at differential on land and property taxes, for example, which make no distinction whether you're building on greenfields or on a difficult brownfield site at the moment. We could look at some of the planning arrangements that we have. So we could make it easier to obtain planning permission on a brownfield site, so perhaps to change of use, as I talked about, from offices to residential, and make it more difficult to get planning permission in the countryside. Those are just a couple of examples. We could also look at development zones or development corporations. So they've been very successful elsewhere, as people have seen similar trends in towns and cities whereby a lot of offices have moved out to business parks and there's been less people living in those towns. So there are a number of policy levers, if you like, that we can pull to influence the development of brownfield sites as a priority ahead of, as I say, the countryside. Because once we concrete over it, it's gone. We won't get it back.
Now, probably 3 or 4 years ago now, there was a drive to identify employment land sites, yes, and to offer incentives for people to establish businesses there and create employment. Has that gone awry? Do you think that in itself isn't working well enough?
I think a lot of the processes, if I look back at the history of our various planning initiatives over a quite a long period of time here, have been well intentioned, but they've taken a long time. And the reality is that we now have to deal with the outcome of that in terms of, if you look in Douglas and elsewhere, our town centres are badly in need of a bit of a lift, and they're very quiet. And you have this very evident trend of offices on the outskirts and people living in new build housing estates. And we should be concerned about that trend, because what does that mean for our towns? My view is it creates an opportunity. It creates an opportunity for us to create an urban renaissance on the Isle of Man, and that's why I'm bringing forward this motion, which I believe is very positive.
Now, well, these moves that you're talking about, would they not be incorporated into the area plan? We know the area plan for the east is currently under development, has been for a number of years. The area plan for the south took years and years to be published, but is now established and in place. Are you talking about tearing those up, or...?
No, I'm not talking about tearing up plans at all. What I'm talking about is an overarching policy, which would, if you like, sit above the various area plans and local plans that have been through so many iterations over a number of years. And we're in the midst of the Eastern Plan at the moment, and then we'll look at the Western Plan and the Northern Plan, and almost by the time that these plans come to fruition, they're well out of date. So what I'm looking for is a bit more of a strategic overlay on what we're doing with our towns. And I firmly believe that we need to be a bit more insightful and a bit more nimble in terms of how we approach this.
And are there any sites in particular that are of concern to you? I mean, there are a number of sites that have been identified within the bounds of your constituency.
Oh, this is not really about my constituency. This is about the regeneration of our towns. And I wouldn't like to highlight any specific site, but there are over 30 sites which I've listed in Douglas, which really are long overdue for development. I mean, as you walk around, as people walk around, they'll know the kind of sites that have lain empty for, in some cases, over 20 years. We're seeing an increasing number of empty office blocks as well. What are we going to do about that? It needs, I believe, a proactive push by government to set in place a policy which will help us regenerate the towns and also protect the Manx countryside.
Now, there is an ongoing review of the planning system in the Isle of Man. To what extent would this want to link in with that? I mean, is planning, in your view, something which is hindering the development of these sites?
I believe that this is complementary and supportive of the planning review, which is, as you say, ongoing, and I suspect will continue to be ongoing. There's a number of aspects, a number of levers that we can pull, and buttons that we can push to drive the prioritisation of urban sites. It's not just about planning. As I said, we can talk about fiscal arrangements. We can also look at the moment, there's lots of empty sites which have laid barren for I say, many decades. Perhaps we should be looking to charge people if they are just sitting on those sites, not actually doing anything with them to the detriment of the town. Perhaps we should be looking at applying some penalties for those as well. There's a whole raft of things we can do. And if you look at, as I say, the Manx towns, a development zone, a development corporation, they would take a very proactive approach in terms of incentivising development of these sites. So I think we need some carrots, we need some real focus, and we need some sticks for perhaps for some people who are really not helping as we look to re-energise and reinvigorate our town centres.
But you mentioned Douglas, and you said there were 30 sites that you'd identified in Douglas, and the notion of penalties for those who are possibly sitting on their hands and not doing anything with the sites. But two of the most prominent sites which come up for the most criticism in Douglas are the Lord Street site and the Summerland site, both under government control. What penalties would you place on government for sitting on its hands and not doing anything? We know there's been a lot of work to try and do something with the Lord Street site.
Exactly. Wouldn't it be great if we saw those sites developed? And it is exciting that we're going to see some development in Douglas with the proposed Travelodge development, and the multi-screen cinema is fantastic. So yeah, I think government also has to step up, and I think government has a number of sites, not just the two that you mentioned in Douglas, which actually we should be getting on and doing things with. And I think we all have an obligation to step up to the plate on this.
Why a committee? Because it seems like every sitting of Tynwald there are bids to have committees appointed to look into things. Why not a motion which gives a positive resolution that will create a result? Because committees can drag on for months, if not years.
They can, and I think there is a concern about the number of committees. I believe by having this committee very focused and by having it to report back by July actually means that it will be focused on delivery and focused on improvement. The challenge that we have with this situation, as we've just talked about, is that it isn't not just one particular area. It's not planning, it's not potentially fiscal arrangements, it's not development aspects of a development corporation. There's a number of different aspects, and there may well be many more. I think the advantage of a committee is that you're able to weigh up all the pros and cons of different options, because every option has some advantages and disadvantages, and then present the findings and recommendations. So I believe that if we move quickly and keep focused, I think a committee is the right way forward.
Although there's criticism of, and I just mentioned it, of committees taking a long time, is the July deadline, slightly too ambitious for something like this, which would be strategic for the whole of the Isle of Man into the future?
I think government, Tynwald committees, they don't have a great reputation for doing things quickly. I would like to produce and be involved in a committee if Tynwald so agrees. I think we can apply some business-like rigour to this and a bit more pace than what we've seen in some other issues. And in many ways, there's a menu of options here which are proven to work in different areas, perhaps not in the Isle of Man, but we can analyse those and bring those forward to Tynwald to decide in terms of recommendations. I would be very wary of having a long drawn-out committee because I think that creates a bit of uncertainty. We need to move quickly, we need to be decisive, and we need to get on with the job.